Thanks to ever-changing technology, many of us now have access to in-home assistants. They help us order our groceries from the comfiness of our own beds. You might have Google Home or Amazon's Alexa. But recently I read a series of hilarious viral tweets that has proven that these wonderful technologies are not always what they're cracked up to be. For one, they often mishear their users. One guy asked Alexa, "Could you please put Pampers on my grocery list?" And Alexa responded, "I've added cancer to your grocery list." One little toddler decided to have a discussion with Alexa before her parents had figured out parental controls and accidentally ordered a very large dollhouse and 5 large bags of treats. Well, the news covered that one, and people's Alexas at home heard that on the news and started ordering for everyone else in town. So, we typically have some troubles with mishearing. Likewise, I know many of us use our smartphones now to text or email using voice to text. We don't type anymore. Maybe we're trying to keep our eyes on the road while we drive. Maybe we're just terrible typers. We have big thumbs. And we use this convenient feature, this intelligence, and it's to use to dictate our text. So we speak into it and it writes it down for us. But again, we fall victim to artificial intelligence mishearing us and sending some really interesting emails and text messages. More than once I've had to try to decipher my mother's text messages when her Android phone can't quite understand her very thick Southern accent. Often I can't decipher it until she decides to type it and resend it. These lists of Siri fails and autocorrect fiascos keep happening. We could speak for hours about the many times this has gone wrong for us. Our tech misunderstands what we're trying to get across. It sends a message we never meant to send. And hearing messages as they are meant to be heard is hard enough from person to person, in person. But when you add the noise and distraction of technology that we have today, this whole new set of problems arises. But truth be told, we humans have been mishearing and misunderstanding what we hear since the dawn of time. And it becomes especially difficult when we're listening for the voice of God. In the case of Samuel in today's reading, we find a confused little boy who hasn't yet learned to listen for God. This little boy lying in the temple floor at night was a novice, but he was also dedicated to God by his mother Hannah, who had prayed for a child and had promised that child to God. Thus, he was already primed to be given a task by God, but he hadn't yet learned to listen. When God came to Samuel, little Samuel didn't know what he was hearing. He assumed it was his mentor, Eli, calling from another room. And frankly, even an elderly priest who should have known better didn't realize very quickly what was happening. Part of the reason is explained at the beginning of the passage when we read that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. People were not having visions or hearing God as they had previously. Thus Samuel, who was very naive, and Eli, who had not heard from God in some time, didn't understand what was happening at first. But God was persistent and kept calling. And eventually wise old Eli caught on. He sent the boy Samuel back to God and said, "Say to the Lord, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Now I want to point out Eli's role in Samuel's call from God is no small matter. I can remember in my own life, as a young teenage girl in a Southern Baptist church in North Georgia, I was discerning a call from God. and it was one that I couldn't figure out for the life of me. Some of you might understand why. On the one hand, I felt like I'm not called to be a children's director or work with orphans in the mission field, but these were the only options given to me when I heard a call from God. Young women just weren't called to do anything else. I served as a chaplain in my Christian club at school. I loved to share the devotion time, which frankly ended up being a sermon most every time. But girls weren't called to preach. That was a few steps beyond what we were allowed to do. But a little bit like Samuel, I grew up in the temple. I didn't sleep next to the Ark of the Covenant or anything cool like that, but I certainly slept under pews while Dad locked up the church. I was a child of the church. I was a minister's kid. And I knew that people heard from God all the time. So when it was my turn to listen, I did my very best with the tradition I had to work with. I knew there were some women pastors out there, but these women seemed a world away, and again, in a totally different tradition than my own. So listening was tough. Even though I knew God was calling me to vocational ministry, I couldn't fully embrace or understand it when it first moved my heart. Instead, it would be years later in college, after spending some time away from church, that a mentor came into my life. And similar to Eli, he helped me understand what God was really saying to me. This professor of religion at my little college in North Georgia not only encouraged me to study the scriptures in more detail, but to study my call in more detail. He knew, unlike I did at the time, that I was being called to preach and to teach, to be an ordained minister. He also knew that this was not only possible for a young woman, but when blessed by God's call, it was an obligation of sorts that I'd never escape. God's persistence came through, not just via continued call on my life, but through that mentor who helped me to decipher that call. And by God's grace, I listened to God, to my professor, and to the voice of those who around me, though they didn't have the same tradition, supported me no matter what. Now, the road to ministry is rarely straightforward. It certainly wasn't for me. It came with its twists and its turns, with my own issues with church following me around. How could I serve a place that had hurt my parents almost as much as it had blessed them? How could I give myself to a calling that could harm my own family that way? How could I risk that kind of sacrifice in my life? Wouldn't it just be easier to take a corporate job that I could leave at work on the weekends? Wouldn't life be a little simpler that way? Yet there was our persistent God, calling me. Even when I didn't ask for God's opinion on my life, there was God. God was asking me to be a little bit uncomfortable, ready to preach and to teach and to pastor, even when I had to reach outside my own tradition. There was God, mediated through the words of a wise mentor, telling me that I had work to do. I feel like I understand Samuel's plight to some degree, though thankfully, God has not asked me yet to tell any of you that your houses are doomed. Thank goodness. But I do understand the struggle to embrace the call. It can seem hard, even impossible. But thankfully, Samuel and I both had mentors willing to help us understand and willing to hear the hard parts of our calling as we worked through them. For Samuel, his plight was tangible. Not only was he being called to prophetic ministry, but he was being called to share a threatening oath against Eli and his whole family. Sharing this call worried him. But upon Eli's insistence, he did, and thankfully, Eli understood God's harsh word, accepted it with resignation. That's not the case for every prophet, as we know. Some hear God's call and run away, like Jonah. Some cower back and feel inadequate and are called to task, like Moses and Jeremiah. Some are even killed for their troubles. And even today, when we're called to do work for God, we might be asked to do something that feels a little out of the ordinary, might even seem odd or off-putting. We might face obstacles in our lives as we live into this call of God. We might lose our reputations, our belongings, our social standing. We might have to move or change our life in other ways. I recognize that most of us here are not accepting a call to vocational ministry, nor will most of us hear an audible word from God like Samuel did. But call stories like Samuel's remind us of one thing, and that is that God is persistently calling us, seeking after us to minister in this world. And we must be listening for that call. We must be ready to follow it, even when it asks a lot of us. Have you ever had the opportunity to be involved in something meaningful, turned it down due to your own busyness, your own schedules, and came to regret it later? Or have you ever heard a rousing speech about mission work and brushed off that feeling of being led into it because you just couldn't imagine this working out for you? I think we often find ourselves not listening. We're not listening because we're too busy or because we're too blinded by our own circumstances. And sometimes we just don't recognize what we're hearing. And thus we have to listen to those mentors in the faith who are around us and teaching us. Sometimes we can't see it, we can't understand it. There was a sci-fi movie some of you might remember from 1988. Some of you might not remember it. It was entitled They Live. And the story is that this drifter in Los Angeles finds a box of sunglasses in an old church building. And he takes out a pair and he puts it on. And suddenly, he's able to see the hidden realities of things around him. For instance, he walks up to magazine stands, and instead of seeing the magazine itself on white paper with black writing, there's something like the subliminal message behind the advertisement. Or if he picks up money, it might say something like, "This is your God," things like this. It was this background history. He also happened to see the aliens who had stolen people's bodies, hence it was a sci-fi cult classic. But I think we can learn something from what he saw through new lenses. By seeing these through a new medium, we can kind of get a glimpse of what it's like to be surrounded by all this stuff we see, all this noise and busyness, and yet we struggle to see the real meaning behind things. We can't home in on those important messages for us. But God's important message is out there. The call of God is out there. God is persistent. God called Samuel 4 times that night. But perhaps we're just not having that lens to hear and understand and see that call. Maybe we are blind to the messages God has for us as we go about our busy lives. Maybe we haven't given space to our spiritual mentors to help us hear and see. What I find most interesting about Scripture is that God is not calling people to live in a certain way or share a certain message, but it's that God doesn't speak in these grand generalities. God speaks to named persons. These are people with whom God has asked to partner in this world to do God's work. And the other side to this is that God calls us through a relationship with the divine, not simply through how much scripture we've memorized or how many Sunday school classes we've attended, though God uses these, of course, to grow our knowledge about God. Samuel knew a lot about God, too. He learned that from his mother Hannah. He learned it from priest Eli. But at the end of the day, Samuel didn't know God personally until he listened for God's call on his own and responded. To Samuel, God sounded a lot like his mentor, Eli. Hence, we should all be listening to our mentors and parents and friends. Sometimes God sounds like the tiniest whisper or nudge in our hearts, which we'll only hear if we stop our busyness long enough to listen carefully. Sometimes God is a feeling, a movement in our heart when we reflect on a sermon or a Bible study, when we're driving our cars or sitting by the lake. However God is reaching out to us today, our job as followers and believers is to listen, and to listen wisely and carefully. Oftentimes we'll hear more of God's movement in our lives when we simply open ourselves to the idea that God is speaking to us. God's relationship with humanity didn't end when the prophets died out. God continues to live in relationship with us today. Nothing shows that more than the sending of Jesus and the hope of resurrection in this world. The truth is, we don't honestly need to invoke God at the beginning of every worship service because God is already here. God is already here and asking us to be in communion with the Spirit and with one another. God has shared so much with us already. All we need to do is to be available and to listen and respond. Now, none of us is perfect. We will likely miss God's call from time to time. We live in what Paul described as clay jars in 2 Corinthians. But these fragile jars hold an immense treasure of the gospel, and we can share it as God calls us to do if we're listening. And we don't have to be afraid of repercussions, even though some may come. Yeah, we might be ostracized. We might be criticized. We even might be vilified. But we will never have more joy and contentment in our lives than if we seek after God in the way God seeks after us, persistently. Paul also reminded the Corinthian church in that same letter that we are so beloved of God that when we are afflicted in every way, we are not crushed. When we are perplexed, we are not driven to despair. When we are persecuted, we are not forsaken. When we are struck down, we are not destroyed. Whatever God may be calling us to do, even if it seems insurmountable, God will never leave us alone when we embrace that call. Simone Weil observed that our faith in Jesus Christ does not mean that we will never experience adversity, but rather that such adversity will grant us the opportunity to discover and come to trust that by God's grace, light is always brighter than darkness, life always stronger than death. And what resides in our broken, apprenticed bodies is the glory of a resurrection waiting to burst forth. One of the beauties of being a Christian is knowing that we have this treasure within us. We are gifted by God's grace to serve others. Determining God's call on our lives does require that we listen outwardly, but we are also blessed to look inward. We look at those personal gifts God has provided us. And as we seek to understand and undertake these ways of living and action in our lives that God has called us to do, we can know that these are both things we can do, even if we're unsure, and things that ultimately will bring us more joy, even if they begin in struggle. So we listen carefully to those God has placed in our lives. We heed the call with a response of, "Here I am." And we live into that call, even when it asks of us something we didn't imagine, even when it seems inopportune or unlikely, because we know that God is more creative and hopeful than any of us can be on our own. And God will never leave us if God calls us. And even those of us who feel small or insignificant can be assured of God's ongoing support with whatever God has called us to do. The story of Samuel promises us this much. May we listen and respond. May we hear God's voice. Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening. Amen.